Hey everybody, I'm back to talk about another movie that I really should have talked about a while ago, but I want to get to it now. I want to commit it to film. Now, some of you do already know my feelings about this movie, but again, I want to put them to film. It feels a bit more complete that way. And if you thought that getting to Wonder Woman 1984 about 2 months late was bad, I'm getting to this one about 7 months too late. This film was it was actually released back in August of 2020, though there's a bit of a story to that too. And that movie is the most recent entry in the SpongeBob franchise, SpongeBob Sponge on the Run. A lot of sponges there. Now, what's interesting about this movie is that, of course, it was originally slated for a much wider release, but the COVID-19 pandemic put a real kibosh on really any theatrical release of that year's. But that movie did get a full wide theatrical release in Canada, so other places around the world, like the US or wherever, they're getting it in 2021 on streaming, and it's just released on Blu-ray as I'm recording this video. But I was one of the people who was privileged enough to see it back in August of 2020. I got the full theatrical experience. And on top of that, when I saw this movie, the cinema I was seeing it at was showing it at about, I think, 4 of their 9 screens. I think it was something like that. And it was middle of the afternoon, so I saw this. I was the only one in the theater at the time. I was the only one. I got the full experience to myself. So there's a few background bits about this movie. And with every new installment in a franchise, it only makes sense to talk about what your feelings are with the with the franchise in general. So the SpongeBob TV show, I really like the show. I grew up watching the show, as did a lot of kids, really most kids after 1999 when it first came out, grew up watching SpongeBob the cartoon. And I really liked it. I thought it started off a little rough, but the animation got really good. It was really funny. It could get very surreal, very strange, but that was all just part of the charm. It was very fun to look at. The characters were very memorable. It's easily Nickelodeon's most successful show, to the point where they were trying recreate it for well over a decade, even decades after its initial release. And it's true, the show definitely did see a decline in quality around the 6th or 7th season, and we'll get to that in a moment. But I definitely like the show. I sort of stopped watching it more often as I grew older, not because I didn't like it or I thought it decreased in quality too much. I just kind of grew out of it and wanted to see some other shows that piqued my interest a little bit more. But if it's on TV or if I see YouTube clips, I'll watch it. I still think it's funny, and I still like watching these characters. And apparently the newest season is really good and getting even stranger with some of its plots. But people seem to like it, so the show's still going strong, and I think that's kind of cool. Now, in terms of SpongeBob movies, the first SpongeBob movie, called SpongeBob Squarepants the Movie, I really liked that. I saw it the year it came out. It had fantastic animation. It's probably the height of jokes and just a great scale. It was pretty much the best way you could possibly do a movie based on SpongeBob. I really don't think you could top the movie format after that, which is one of the problems we'll get into, but in due time. And on a side note, a funny story about that movie is when we saw it, it was my whole family wanted to go see a movie. Now, the choices that would kind of benefit everyone were, it was the first National Treasure movie, and then SpongeBob SquarePants the movie. Now, my mom and dad more or less really wanted to see National Treasure, but because I was about 10 at the time and my siblings were younger, one of the parents had to stay with the kids, so my mom got to see National Treasure, and my dad had to take me, my brother, and I think my sister as well, to SpongeBob. And he says to date that is the only movie he could never sleep through, and it was the most annoying thing he has ever seen in his life. Now, for my dad to not fall asleep during a movie, that's pretty substantial, so the movie left an impact on him too, though obviously not very favorably. So yeah, I really liked the first movie, thought it was a ton of fun. The second movie, Sponge Out of Water, I still haven't seen. I know I probably should have watched it before, viewing this movie or talking about it, but I've just had no interest in seeing it. I really always thought, one, that you really couldn't do a SpongeBob movie outside of the first one. I think that one kind of is, it really only had enough steam to really go through one movie. And on top of that, they made the second one, in my opinion, way too late. They waited 14 years. It came out in 2018, which is really too long a time. I mean, if you know anything about Exorcist 3 or Blues Brothers 2000, if you wait over a decade for a sequel, you're gonna lose a great deal of the core audience. And even then, the new audience may not be as receptive to it because you've waited too long. And from what I hear, the opinions of the movie they're very mixed. Some people think it was okay, some people really didn't like it, some people didn't see it, some people don't really care. So I don't have an opinion about that movie, which I know I should have seen it again, but I just never got around to it. And if I do, I may or may not make a video about it. We'll see what happens. So now we've got the newest one, SpongeBob Sponge on the Run, which made the wise decision of at least coming out only a few years after the last entry and not over a decade. And it's also notable because where Sponge Out of Water had mostly, it fooled you with the advertisement. I think that was kind of a bad move on the movie's part. They fooled you with the advertisement. They made it look as though it was going to be mostly CG, mostly the characters out of the water, hence the title. But from what I can tell, a lot of it actually took place underwater. It was still the 2D animation, so they lied to you. This one, however, does not do that. It is the first fully computer-animated SpongeBob movie. The characters have a whole new art style, which we'll get to in a bit. And that's kind of cool. Excuse me again. The director of this movie, Tim Hill, he's had some experience with SpongeBob. He's worked on the show, and he's done a few movies before this. I honestly can't remember what they are, but from what I do remember the titles, some of them are okay, some are not. So it's his first movie, and I really hate to say this, but I did not like this movie. And it's not just it's not just that the movie didn't do anything for me. Like, I actively disliked it. It's not just it was neutral and I say it's more in the negative. I really did not like this movie. Now, I think this movie does deserve its day in court. If you want to see it as a fan of SpongeBob or not, it deserves to be judged on its own accord. So I'm not saying outright don't see it, but I really didn't enjoy it. And it comes down to three major problems, though there's a ton of little things. But before I do that, I'll just give you a quick sum up of the story. So this story is, tell me if you've heard this one before. So SpongeBob is just, enjoying his life in Bikini Bottom. Everything's all hunky-dory. It's just great. Plankton gets a bright idea to try and steal the Krabby Patty's secret formula, and in this case, he realizes that SpongeBob is the one who's always thwarting his evil schemes. So he kidnaps SpongeBob's pet snail Gary and gives him to King Neptune because it turns out King Neptune is very arrogant about his age. And it turns out snail slime, if you put it all over your face, it'll help basically with wrinkles. It makes you look pretty. But he's run out of snails, so Plankton sees this as his opportunity. He kidnaps the snail, gives it to King Neptune, and then SpongeBob and Patrick, of course, have to go on a journey to get the snail. And from that point on, of course, Plankton, takes over the Krusty Krab, and it's all a plot to save the world, more or less. So, yeah, that's the story. And this isn't one of my major problems, but this is kind of strike one, and one of the major problems I find outside of the first SpongeBob movie. There's really not a lot of story potential you can do with SpongeBob outside of the first movie. Now, that movie I don't think is perfect. My biggest problem with the first movie is that we didn't get a lot of time with a lot of the TV characters. It was mostly, we did get, appearances here and there, but it was mostly SpongeBob, Patrick, and, Mr. Krabs and Squidward did get a lot of appearances, but I guess mostly they didn't have Sandy, and they didn't have her on the road trip, and I thought that was kind of a wasted opportunity. You could have had a lot of fun with SpongeBob and Patrick's idiocy playing off her smartness, so that was always my problem. I don't know how well they utilized the other characters in the second movie, but that's the thing. And on top of that, this is the plot that you tell in several episodes. Again, Plankton, he has a plan to steal the formula, and usually involves SpongeBob. In this case, he kidnaps the snail, which we already saw in a SpongeBob episode. There was a special called Gary Come Home, where the snail leaves to find a better owner. So we've already seen this plot done. And it's not that you can't have repeated or shared ideas in SpongeBob, but you really need to bring something new. And this is the third time that we've seen the movie revolve around Plankton trying to get the formula. At least I'm assuming. Again, I haven't seen the second one, but I'm assuming that's part of the idea. If not, you can correct me, but that's just what I know about it. So that's not my main problem with the movie, but that's sort of why I feel maybe they should kind of not make a movie, or if they're going to make a movie, they really need to think outside the box and really go more full force with it, because I think there's just not a lot of potential. So, yeah, and another problem I have with this movie, which is kind of a major one, and I feel bad for saying this, I'm not a fan of the animation. Now, I'm probably a little biased towards this because, again, I grew up with the show and the first movie, and even the second movie, again, from what I hear, does have mostly 2D animation. So right now, that's almost, almost 20 years, over 20 years, actually, of 2D animation that most people are familiar with. Even the new audiences being introduced to the show are familiar with the way the characters look in 2 dimensions, not 3. And I think that's a real disadvantage to the show, because even though the animation had a very simple style in the original show, you could also play with it a lot more. You could get bigger expressions and more creative backgrounds, and the movement could be a lot smoother because 2D animation by its nature is more stylized. And I just found that by turning them 3D, not only does it kind of look really jarring, I'm just so not used to seeing them in 3D, but it doesn't feel... It feels kind of cheap. Like, there's a lot of points where the characters are moving, and you can tell they're trying to give these big, over-the-top expressions, like SpongeBob's eyes are like, ugh, like, he'll just do something like that, but it doesn't look nearly as good as it would in 2D. And I'm not against, CG animation, like the modern Disney movies, all CG. A lot of them are great. I have no problem with it. It needed either more of a budget or just more creativity. Or don't even do that. Just stick with 2D. That's kind of what people know it for. That's what people like it for. And on top of that, 2D animation nowadays is actually mostly done on computers. It's not all hand-drawn by hand. It is done on the computer, but it's done in a way so it looks like it's still drawn on paper. I know that doesn't make much sense, but you could still do it with 2D animation. And that's not to say that the movie... And also, another reason why it works in 2D and not 3D is because SpongeBob's always had a very limited amount of character models. Now, we all recognize, the main characters, and they're all very unique, but a lot of the background fish in Bikini Bottom, you'll notice that a lot of the models are used over and over and over again. Like, sometimes one model can play dozens of characters, but that just works, and you can hide it better in 2D. You can get more stylized. With 3D, you can't really do that. And it's not my biggest problem, but I really feel that does hurt the movie a lot more, because there were so many times where I'm watching this movie and I'm just noticing that this fish already did another role, or this fish did something. It's just all these characters keep showing up, and it just starts to kind of look cheap, but not in a fun way, or like they don't even poke fun at it. Like, didn't we see you before already? Nope. Like, they don't even do jokes like that. They just kind of show the characters straight up. So that's my first problem. And the second, it really is the story, but it's not because it's a repeat of basically the first movie, which does bother me a bit, but my main problem is how this story really doesn't have much of a focus. It really doesn't have much of a heart to it. Now, I just told you the basics about Plankton stealing the snail, but there's a lot of stuff that happens in this movie, and I am going to give a bit more spoilers because it's SpongeBob. It's not like any of these events are going to change the way you look at the characters, okay? And I know I said I didn't hate that it was a repeat, but it's trying so hard to be the first movie and fail. Like, for example, in the first movie, there's a scene towards the last third where SpongeBob and Patrick are found by a deep-sea diver, and he takes them to his store, which is basically, a place where he takes sea animals and he turns them into cheap knickknacks, and that's what he wants to do to them. Now, that part of the movie, the SpongeBob and Patrick are still drawn 2D, but the environment around them is live action. And that was kind of cool. You could really play with how they interact with things, and the contrasting look of stuff was really kind of cool. In this movie, they do another scene like that. They're on a road trip. Of course, they're on a road trip. And suddenly they come across an Old West town. Now, we've seen SpongeBob do the Old West, but it's live action, and there's zombies, and it turns out Danny Trejo is the Grim Reaper, I think. I think they give him another name, but he's basically the Grim Reaper. And SpongeBob and Patrick come there to help them, even though that wasn't their intention. But they come in this old western town with zombies, and Danny Trejo's the Grim Reaper, and he wants to, take their souls to hell pretty much. But they thwart him because they shine sunlight on his body, and he turns to ashes. Now that'd be one thing. That'd be one thing if that was like a totally out of nowhere scene. I could accept that. What really hurts it, though, is that they're constantly saying, oh, this is all just a dream. Like, they're on the road, and suddenly it's like, oh, we're in a dream where we're in an old western town, and there's zombies. Which would be fine if it was a dream, but if it is a dream, you're taking us out of the investment. And this is a scene where SpongeBob and Patrick are captured by the Grim Reaper. That could be both really intense and really funny, but they don't really do anything with it. They just constantly have SpongeBob and Patrick question whether or not it's a dream. And then it turns out it was a dream, but it wasn't a dream, because what also happens is while they're in the Old West town, they come across... I'll be honest, it's kind of a funny cameo, but it ultimately outweighs the joke. So again, back to the first movie. In the first movie, the main cameo was David Hasselhoff. So they escape the deep sea diver, and they come across David Hasselhoff in a... Oh, damn, what was he in? Baywatch? Yeah, a Baywatch parody. He's running across the beach, and he stops them, and he helps to take them home to Bikini Bottom. Now, that was really funny. That was really funny, first off, the fact that David Hasselhoff was just in this movie. But on top of that, they take the cameo, and they really have fun with it. Because, again, Hasselhoff is known for Baywatch, so... he swims them to Bikini Bottom, but it's funny because then he goes like a plank, and they ride him like a boat, like he's a motorized boat all the way to Bikini Bottom. That was really funny, and that utilized the cameo in a very clever way. It didn't overstay its welcome, it did work its way into the story, and it was just funny. In this one, I know why they did the cameo, because the cameo is Keanu Reeves, okay? It's Keanu Reeves. And I know why they did it, because Keanu Reeves right now is on a real hot streak. He's off of the John Wick movies. He's becoming this big action star. People are loving him all over again. Excuse me. Which is fine. I have no problem with Keanu Reeves. I think he's a decent actor. But he shows up as the Sagely figure, which is kind of funny, because he does appear as a talking head. It's literally just his live action head in a tumbleweed of sage. Now that's funny the first time. But then it gets progressively less funny and less creative the more they use it. And it'd be okay, honestly, if SpongeBob and Patrick held on to him, but he keeps disappearing and then coming back to deliver more sagely advice, but it doesn't really add up to much. Which could be funny, but just, it's one of those things where the execution and the fact that you've already seen this in like 2 other movies that really prevents it from being funny. So on one hand, it's kind of funny, but it also is a joke that just wears itself too thin, and it doesn't work this time. Or Plankton, trying to steal the formula, that's his thing, and we've seen this a million times in this show, a million times. But every time it happens, there's always a bit of a creativity to how he's doing it. This time, like in the first movie, I know I keep going back to this, but I really can't stress this enough. It is trying so hard to be the first movie, but it fails at it, and it doesn't understand why the first one was a success. So Plankton, he doesn't steal the formula. He gets in the first movie, when what Plankton did was he framed Mr. Krabs to look like he stole the crown of King Neptune. So King Neptune, froze him in place, and because of this, the Chum Bucket was the only place that was open, so Plankton could, get people to wear these novelty hats that it turns out were mind control devices. And with those mind control devices, he was able to enslave the entire town and make them, his slaves. And so in that regard, his plan really worked into the plot. There was an end game, world domination. And it really worked. It made sense to get SpongeBob and Patrick out of there so they couldn't stop him. It worked to get Mr. Krabs out of the way. All these plans came together and were really thought through. In this one, Plankton, sends SpongeBob off so there's no one to make Krabby Patties, and the Krusty Krab goes out of business. And then when he comes by to, take the formula, Mr. Krabs just gives it to him, And then what? Plankton, he does nothing. He literally does nothing. There is no secondary plan. He is just like, well, I kind of thought there'd be a bit more excitement and reward to getting the formula, but now this is just kind of depressing. Which sounds funny, but it's not. It just reminds you that this plot wasn't really thought out. He wanted to steal the formula, he gets it, and then he doesn't do anything with it. And this does come back later on, but it doesn't really... It just doesn't add up to anything. It's frustrating how so many of these plot points are just not well thought through. And speaking of which, I keep talking about King Neptune. He's more or less the main villain of this show, of this movie. Now, if you remember the first movie again, you'll remember that King Neptune, one, he didn't look like this. Like King Neptune in that one, he had a big red beard, and his thing was that he was constantly worried about going bald. I can testify for that. And so when Mr. Krabs stole the crown, it was a pride thing. It was a big pride thing for him. Now here they do have Neptune being vain, but it's not the same design. It's not the same type of character. So I'm just distracted by the point that this is not the same Neptune as was in the first movie, or even really the show. The Neptune in the show was different from the Neptune in this movie. And so I'm constantly distracted by that point. And he lives... Now, I will say there is one funny joke involving him, and he lives in Atlantic City. Or maybe it was Atlantis City. Basically, I think it's Atlantic City, which one is a pun on, the Atlantic Ocean, even though SpongeBob takes place in the Pacific. But also, Atlantic City is this big Las Vegas, casino town, kind of like the real Atlantic City. That was funny. But also so much around him is not funny. Now... But before I get to the final problem, I think I'll give some of the few moments I found kind of interesting. But even then, they're more backhanded compliments than anything. So I'll give the movie this. There is more focus put on the secondary characters. Mr. Krabs isn't frozen throughout the whole thing. We have Sandy, we have Squidward. And near the last third of the movie, Plankton joins the group too, because he doesn't like the fact his life now no longer has meaning. So he wants the group to, get together and go rescue SpongeBob and Patrick, because they find out they're about to be tried, for treason for trying to steal Gary back. Now that was kind of cool, but that was only a 10-second scene where they're on the road going, woohoo! And it does lead to something, but it leads to, the climax of this movie is it's so frustrating for so many reasons. I'll get to the main reason why in a minute. But the secondary reason is it's just not exciting. Like, I remember the first movie, and that climax was just so much fun. They're riding David Hasselhoff. They're fighting off the secondary villain who's been hunting them this whole time. They have to, there's a musical scene, where SpongeBob sings the Twisted Sister song, I Wanna Rock. Like, that was awesome. In this, we have a trial scene where SpongeBob and Patrick try and plead their case in front of the king. And then all the friends come in and they try and plead their case in front of the king. And God, I can't keep holding it back, but just a little longer. And then through a series of shenanigans, they sneak off the stage. And they're in a giant suit of armor and they're constantly being chased. Which would be fine, but I was so bored watching it. I was just so bored. There was just no sense of fun, no sense of timing, no sense of action. Like, there's an action scene going on, but it was so boring. And even the ending message is, I guess they've done messages like this in SpongeBob where they, try and do the whole, you don't have to be that handsome, it's about how you are as a character. But, I didn't care by that point. I was just so done with this movie. So, the animation I find jarring, the fact that the story is trying so hard to be like the first movie and failing. But I'll tell you the main reason why I didn't like this movie. Now, this requires a bit of backstory. So, SpongeBob, the show, was created by Steven Hillenburg. And Steven Hillenburg had more or less pretty tight control over the show for most of the runtime. Now, the show did start to suffer in from season about 6 till maybe season 9. 6 and 7 were definitely the worst, but till about season 9. And a lot of that was because during that time, Hillenburg had left the show to work on the first movie, because he directed the first movie, and that's why it turned out so good. And that's kind of why the show suffered. Now, what Nickelodeon had wanted to do for a long time is they wanted to do a prequel show called Camp Coral, which would take place at this camp that would show, all the major characters as younger kids. It would show how SpongeBob, met Patrick and Squidward and Sandy and how they all met each other. But for years, Steven Hillenburg would not let them do the show. He said, no, you're not touching my creation like this. And Steven Hillenburg, when he passed away, I think he passed away in 2018. I'm sorry if I'm getting it wrong. But after he passed away, very tragically, Nickelodeon sprung almost instantly, like that. Like, wiped out half of humanity with that snap. And they announced that a show, Camp Coral, was in production, that they were going to go through with this. Now, obviously, they didn't admit this, but then Steven Hillenburg's friend tweeted saying how Nickelodeon pretty much, in a very scummy move, they pretty much waited until his death so that they could announce the show, because now he wasn't around to inhibit their creative process. So that already, if you're a fan of SpongeBob, that got under my skin to begin with. And aside from just the ethical problem of Nickelodeon doing this, the idea of Camp Coral is inherently kind of a bad one, because not only does it totally go against a lot of the continuity of the show, and SpongeBob was never a show that was really big on continuity. They were mostly about episodic jokes. But if you knew the show, you know that SpongeBob and Patrick met a different way. Him and Sandy met a different way. Him and Squidward, Mr. Krabs, Plankton, they all met... They met differently than how the Camp Coral wanted to do this. And on top of that, the idea of Camp Coral really limits a lot of the potential ideas. It's not fun. I mean, they'd be kids in a camp. That limits so many potential story ideas. There's a million more ideas you can take advantage of when they're adults and under the sea. There's just more potential there. And what this movie does, what I really truly hated about this movie, is it felt so much like this was meant to be a promo / unofficial pilot for Camp Coral. Because all throughout this movie, and I mean all throughout this movie, whenever the characters are talking, Patrick will say, it reminds me that time of when I met SpongeBob at Camp Coral. It's like a Family Guy joke, except it's SpongeBob now. And the show will go into a flashback of how, SpongeBob met Patrick, how he met, Plankton, Mr. Krabs, Sandy. And this takes up a decent part of the movie. In fact, the last third of this movie, we get Mr. Krabs, Squidward, and Sandy, and even Plankton telling how they met each other at Camp Coral. Which not only took up 20 minutes of the movie, 20 minutes of this movie. Now, this movie, if I remember correctly, is only about maybe an hour and a half. So that's like almost a third of the movie is just these characters saying a Family Guy sketch. Like, I met SpongeBob at this point. I met SpongeBob at this point, and this is how he changed my life. Which is not only a waste of time, but again, it doesn't follow the continuity. For example, in the show, SpongeBob met Sandy. She was trying to wrestle a clam, and he more or less helped her escape it. They found out that he knew karate, and then she invited him over to her house where he couldn't breathe. That's what happened to the show. In Camp Coral, they make it look like, again, they met at camp, which I suppose you could argue that as kids they met, but then years later they forgot they knew each other. But they forgot they knew each other, but shouldn't their reunion have been more like, hey, I haven't seen you since camp? It's one of those things that it so infuriates me, because not only is it, again, violating the continuity, I know I'm talking like I'm some gatekeeper for the show. Not only does it go against the continuity of the cartoon, but it felt like it did two things. It made this movie feel like its only reason to exist was to promote a cartoon that Nickelodeon so wanted to make, but I don't know if they're actually going to make it now. I think a lot of fan backlash has been pretty harsh, but, only time will tell. But more than that, and it's very rare I'll say this about a movie based on a franchise. Now, I try to think of myself as open to movies based on franchises. Whether it's a comic book movie or a movie based on a book, I like to try and think of myself as open to these ideas, because a movie and a film and a book, or a film and a comic, or a film and a TV show are very different things. You have to change them so that you can fit the medium's restrictions. And I really think you should look at these adaptations as movies first. You can definitely compare them to the source material. Like, The Last Airbender movie is complete garbage, for example. But So I don't like doing that many comparisons. But this is one of the only times where I genuinely felt insulted as a fan of the original material. Now, I haven't read many of the Harry Potter books. I haven't read many Marvel comics. I have seen a few Nickelodeon shows, like, again, Avatar: The Last Airbender compared to the movie, or some anime adaptations, and I get it. There's changes, and sometimes the adaptation is not as good as the book, or Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Like, I think lots of people have read the book compared to both movies, and, both movies have problems, but I can still look at both of them, acknowledge their faults, what had to be changed. And even with the worst movie, in my opinion, The Last Airbender, I was still able to disconnect it, because that's just a bad movie compared to a great show. This is one of the only times I've ever truly felt insulted. I felt insulted by Nickelodeon for not only trying to push, not trying to make a good movie. They tried to make a pilot for a TV show, but mark it as an installation of a show I grew up with and still hold dear to my heart, even though it's not sacred to me, but I still think the show is good. And the fact that it's based on a show that has little creative potential, but it just so feels insulting to the memory of Steven Hillenburg. And he's not a guy who I've really followed his career that much, though I've looked up a bit about him. He seems like a really cool guy, but I just can't stress how much, as a fan of the show, as a guy who respects Steven Hillenburg's work, I just felt so insulted. I was squirming in my seat for the last 30 minutes of this movie. I was sitting there. I was squirming. My arms were crossed. I was pouting. I was going... My eyes were rolling. I was struggling so hard not to walk out. The only reason I didn't walk out is because, to be fair, it's a very short movie, and I knew it was going to be over very soon. Now, I know I was the only one person, so I kind of cheated, but the minute Sandy said, "I remember when I met SpongeBob at Camp Coral," I just shouted out, "No, you didn't!" And I got so mad at that, and I hated it, and it instantly made it a movie that I don't know if I'll ever see again. Maybe I will, and maybe, who knows, upon the second viewing I'll have changed my opinion, but that movie, it really affected me in a way that most movies don't. I just felt so personally insulted by it that all this would happen. The director, Nickelodeon, they just felt that they could try and throw this product at you and attempt to promote their other show. So, yeah, I don't know what else to really say about it. I just hated this movie. Now, with that said, if you want to see the movie, there's probably lots of people who are going to enjoy it. Again, it did get it did get decent reviews from critics. It was fairly widespread release in Canada, and it's on Blu-ray now, so if you want to either stream a copy or buy the Blu-ray and give it a watch. Hold on a second. Okay, I don't know, something on my camera said something. Watch it for yourself and see what you think. I'm so curious what people's thoughts on this movie were, because I didn't like it, but maybe you'll like it, or maybe you'll feel the same way and find that you just couldn't stand it. And I'm honestly about to run out of space. This went on a lot longer than I meant it to, so thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time with more recent movies. Bye for now.